I call the Honourable Member David Clendon.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker.
Tēnā koe.
Mr Speaker, we think it's a sad day that this bill is passing through the House, passing in some haste in order to meet the deadline set by the passing in equal haste last year of the video surveillance legislation that was required to correct an obvious shortcoming in the legislation, and we know what upset that caused. So this bill has one or two small redeeming features. It does bring together legislation. It brings together provisions that are currently spread around a lot of legislation, a lot of it quite old legislation. It's entirely appropriate. We should routinely update, rationalise pieces of legislation, and this bill does to some extent achieve that. It does put some constraints around surveillance and other activities of agencies where currently there are no such constraints, and that is a good thing. But we've heard a little bit about balance in relation to this bill, at achieving a balance between enabling the state to go about necessary work to detect criminal and other behaviour, other undesirable behaviour, and the protection of human rights and civil liberties. And frankly, we see this bill as failing very badly in achieving that appropriate balance. This bill is overwhelmingly negative in that it clearly seeks to give the widest possible powers to the police, to customs, to the Department of Internal Affairs, to fisheries, and to a whole swathe of other government officials who hereafter will be enabled to make the most extraordinary intrusions into the private business of New Zealand citizens who may well simply be going about their legal and honest business. So there's simply no justification for such a wide-ranging, all-encompassing, enabling approach. We simply do not have the political climate, the legal, the social context that requires the level of intrusion that this bill will allow. This is far beyond the reasonable needs of the police or any other government enforcement agencies. So the argument that this level of intrusion need only concern criminals, that honest people may rest assured that their privacy, the integrity of their homes and business and indeed of their person will not be compromised, that argument, sir, simply does not wash. It was interesting to hear from a contribution from a government member in an earlier debate who made a comment along the lines that he had did not have a lot of interest in the human rights of those who are not interested in obeying the law. And that statement to me reflected the underpinning, dare I say it, the ideological or philosophical underpinnings of this bill that would willingly undermine civil liberties and human rights on a very weak, a very poor justification. The onus is absolutely on the state in a liberal democracy to maximise the protection, to give the greatest possible protection to human rights and civil liberties. And any tendency to move away from that initial premise is the beginning. It's a step down a very slippery slope. It's a step towards a situation where the state is enabled to intervene and intrude in an inappropriate way. It is a step towards a New Zealand that none of us would seek to live in, that none of us would want to, if we saw it happening, it would be recognised as a very unfortunate move for a country that does pride itself on civil liberties, on being a truly democratic state. This bill, for example, goes a very long way to breaking down some very long-held legal conventions, such as the right to silence. This bill clearly removes, in many instances, the right of individuals to avoid self-incrimination. People can be obliged to hand over documents and other forms of storage of data to make statements that is very likely to incriminate them if they have been guilty of some criminal act. That right to self-incrimination, not to self-incriminate rather, is a very long-held tradition, a convention with some centuries of history, and it's very unfortunate that this bill breaks that convention with so little real justification or need. This bill chips away at the integrity, the status of information that is shared in confidence, information that we consider to be privileged, information that individuals may have shared with their lawyers, with their ministers of religion, with their medical doctors, with psychologists, indeed with the media. There is no legitimate reason. These communications, this privileged information, should be sacrosanct, except in the most extreme circumstances. And this bill enables those forms of communication, those forms of privilege, to be compromised, to be broken on some very, very weak underpinnings, on some very, very, very weak suspicions. And the apparent safeguards contained in this bill are clearly inadequate. Once information is out of the box, once information has been seen, it cannot be unseen. It is known to authorities and is very likely to be used in some ways, and that's simply inappropriate. I think it's worth going back to considering the numbers and the strength, should I say, of organisations who found fault with this bill, who made objection to it, who made commentaries to it and objected to many of the provisions in the bill. People like some of our major law firms who are concerned about the powers that it gave state agencies and others, and the breaking of some of those long-held legal conventions. The New Zealand Law Society, the Human Rights Commission, the Privacy Commission, the Council for Civil Liberties, the Council of Trade Unions, the New Zealand College of Clinical Psychologists, Telecom, with a major concern clearly in the transmission of electronic data and information. These are not organisations who operate without giving some reasonable thought to their statements. They all found fault with this bill. This is the purpose clearly of a select committee process, and we acknowledge the select committee did wind back some of the most extreme provisions of the initial drafting, but was not able to go far enough. Clearly there was not the will within the majority on that committee to put this bill back to a level, to put the provisions of this bill in a way that would protect rather than compromise civil liberties and human rights in New Zealand. It's also instructive to go back to the departmental report from August 2010, the report of the Select Committee, that summarised the nature of the many hundreds of submissions that were made and the concerns that were expressed by New Zealanders as individuals, as organisations, and indeed some very high-powered, well-researched and thoughtful organisations. A common complaint was that the bill expands the powers of police and other agencies in a dangerous manner. And that word came through quite routinely if you scan the submissions. People see real danger to themselves, to their communities, to the integrity of private information and indeed people's private lives by some of the provisions in this bill. This bill was seen as a threat to political activism. We value, and I'm sure members of all sides of this House value the fact that New Zealanders have the right to object, to demonstrate, to be politically active and to oppose the government of the day. And I think that is something, when large numbers of New Zealanders are seeing this bill as a threat to their ability to be politically active, to protest, to demonstrate, then we should give pause to think what is going wrong here. Many commentators observed that this bill encroaches on human rights and that it contains insufficient safeguards. And having acknowledged, as I have, that certainly the Select Committee process, the later drafting, did put better safeguards, it is still clearly inadequate. This bill sets very, very low thresholds, very low standards for reasonable grounds to suspect and therefore give state agencies the right to intrude in the most extraordinary ways, to break into people's houses and cars without warrant under some situations, to insert surveillance devices which may involve cameras, video recordings, direct remote accessing of people's electronic communications. These are extraordinary powers given with completely insufficient concern for civil liberties and human rights. I think the last word, unusually perhaps, can go to the media, to the recent editorial in the New Zealand Herald that said that the powers of search, seizure and surveillance are necessary tools of law enforcement, but they need to be carefully balanced with civil liberties. The editorial said the right to silence is a cornerstone of civil liberties and this bill goes too far. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Dr. Cam Calder.
Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to rise and make a brief contribution to the third reading of the Search